So today we're going to be talking about scales, and this is the first video on scales, but it follows directly from those last two videos on pitch 1 and pitch 2, where in the first one we talked about, we were introduced to all those white notes on the keyboard and we learned the letter names, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And then in the follow-up video on pitch, we added in the black notes, all the sharps and flats, and we saw the full chromatic scale, all 12 pitches, all half steps. And this is an example of scales. We'll just look at a few more examples of scales today. Specifically, we're going to be looking at two called pentatonic, and the other one which is called major. So these form a nice pair, as you will see as when we go. But what are scales? Here we go again. I've already kind of introduced this notion, but a scale comes from the word escalator, right? Scala, and this scale just means a series of steps, and we learned about steps in the last pitch video, so it's just appropriate that we'll have scales now being collections of steps. So sometimes those are whole steps, sometimes those are half steps, and oftentimes it's a mix of whole steps and half steps, and occasionally bigger intervals too, as we'll see. So, but the essence is a scale is just a collection or a series of musical steps. So let's look at this a little bit. It's going to require that we review because it's crucial to understand what we mean by steps. And steps are, as I've said, intervals, and intervals measure the distance between two notes. Steps are the smallest difference between two notes. So the half steps are the equal difference between each and every note on the keyboard. And if we look at that on the keyboard, we can just play a bunch of chromatic half steps. So the distance between these two notes is a half step. The distance between these two notes, half step. These two notes, half step. These two notes, half step, half step, half step, half step, etc. And you could go on and on. Every single one, each adjacent note on the piano forms a half step with its neighbor, with its most immediate neighbor. Those all be half steps, and they're all the same interval. They're the same distance between those two notes. And we looked at how putting those all together in order, going from C to C, for example, as you can see with the blue dots, just having every single note, will produce what's called chromatic scale. And we kind of saw that last time. The full chroma, all the colors, all the spectrum available to you through the half steps. And we contrasted this last time with what I called whole steps, and whole steps were just two half steps. So as you can see here, if I'm going from C to D, in the first example there, when I go from C to D, that's a whole step because it has two half steps contained within it. And you can hear the difference in the quality of the whole step versus the half step, right? Yeah, and we kind of went over that in the last video as well, especially with the Gershwin piece. So, just the whole step was just that, two half steps. And these are going to come together to make scales. In fact, we actually, just like we had a chromatic scale, all half steps, we also have what's called whole tone scale. In other words, all whole steps. And so take a look at that. You can start on this note here, C sharp or D flat, and you can hear a whole tone scale there. But this is a strange scale. It doesn't sound so much familiar to us. Like, not a whole lot of music is written using only whole tones, because people really like half steps. So, by the way, whole tone, whole step, same thing. So when I say whole tone scale, or this just means exactly the same thing as would be meant by a whole step scale, whole tone scale. Now, you notice that this is every other note on the piano. Well, you could start on a C sharp and get this exact scale, but you could also imagine you could start this scale on any note and then just write out all whole steps until you get to the next octave, and then you'll have a whole tone scale. But so this is really important right here at the beginning. Once we've reviewed our intervals, our half steps and our whole steps, just to remember that with scales, when you measure out between an octave, like C to C, right? Or in this case, C sharp to C sharp. You measure out that octave and you decide, okay, how many steps are going in between that octave? And what's the pattern of half steps and whole steps in there? That's going to make your scale. So in this case, we have maybe what would be called like a C sharp whole tone scale. But you could put that and have it start and end on any note and then create the same pattern of half steps and whole steps. In this case, just a pattern of all whole steps. And then you would have a different whole tone scale, or a whole tone scale, maybe it's the same notes, like the same pitches, but arranged around, let's say, F to F. That way, we can start to understand how you can take a scale, take an arrangement of whole steps and half steps, and uproot it from where it was and just put it on a different set of notes. But if you keep the relationships the same, if you keep the whole steps and half steps, if you keep the intervals the same, as you move to a new key, basically going from, C sharps to going to like C sharp to C sharp going to F, then you will sound almost the same. It will sound just transposed. And so we'll take a look at many examples of this, but this is a crucial musical concept, absolutely so important, that as long as you keep the relationships in a scale or the relationships in a melody between the notes, if you keep those the same, you can change the position of that melody or change the position of that scale on the piano as much as you want and perform it anywhere. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. In fact, we'll see a few good examples of that as we get through this video. So still in review, right? Because we've seen this before. This was just all the white notes on the keyboard there. And in fact, this set of pitches does form a scale. So some of you will recognize this sound. This is the sound of C major, of major sound starting and ending on C. And that brings us to a kind of further definition of scale, where scale is a pattern of intervals or a pattern of half steps and whole steps that repeats at the octave, where 8, the eighth note, the octave, equals 1, equals the first note. Right. So take a look at the numbers there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1, because C is 1, back to C, this is 1 again. So 8 equals 1 there. And the little hat just means scale degree. So we'll use that to indicate, because we might use the numbers for other things in a score or in a, for counting rhythm or for doing, fingerings on an instrument. So we'll need that little hat sometimes just to tell that we mean scale degree 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. 8 equals 1. And these will be really handy later when we get into further kinds of music theory. So it's good to know now. When we first learn scales, you use those scale degrees. Yeah, just as I said, scale degrees there have a caret, have a little hat that indicate that it is a scale degree. So that means you're on the fourth note, counting up from the root note, from the first note, you're up on the fourth note. You're on the fourth scale degree. So in a C scale like this, scale degree 4 is F. In a C scale like this, scale degree 7 is B. And that will always be, so if you see a B, that will be scale degree 7 in this scale. Okay, so that's scale degrees. Now we're going to want to ask ourselves, what makes up the sound of that scale? And we kind of talked about this before, but that is the sound of a melody or the sound of a scale. It can carry emotions, it can move you, it can have all these associations, all these important meanings. But when you ask, like, what music theory constructions are being put together, what little elements of music are being put together to make that sound happen, like to make that sound that can even have an association like happy or sad or whatever. And the answer is, of course, the pattern of intervals. So using the scale, basically. What is the scale? Okay, so this will be so important, especially when we start talking about keys and about melodies that involve multiple scales. Anyways, there's so much complexity, but we'll start here with the very basics. And again, we have to measure out the whole steps and the half steps. So which one's which? Well, maybe if you watched in the review video, or maybe you already know, but from C to D, from scale degree 1 to 2 here, we've got a whole step, right? Let's take a look at the keyboard. C to D, whole step. D to E, whole step. E to F, half step. F to G, whole, half. Okay, so if I do that again from the bottom, whole, half, whole, half. And that's our pattern. That's our major scale pattern. Try to memorize this pattern because I think it'll be really helpful for you. So if you get to know this, that if you want a major sound, if you want to be in the major mode, if you want to compose a major piece, or if you want to have a scale that's a major scale, you're going to need exactly this pattern of half steps and whole steps. Whole, half, whole, half. So once again, that is 2 wholes and then a half, and then 3 wholes and then a half. And these are the steps. These are the intervals in between the notes. So you've only got, you've got 7 here because you've got 8 notes to get intervals between. Even though the 8th note equals the first note because you have the interval between 7 and 8. So between 1 and 2, whole, between 2 and 3, whole, 3 and 4, half. So whole, half, whole, half. And if we were in the classroom, I would make you say it with me, like whole, half, whole, half. And if you want major, that's the pattern that you need to know. Okay, let's do some things with this. Let's take a look. And like I said, that is the major scale. The major scale is just that pattern of intervals between notes. You need a whole step and then a half step. And then 3 whole steps and then a half step. And I promise you, if you apply that, you will get major. Even if, like I said earlier, if you start on any of the notes. Okay? So let's take some examples. Like I said, this is going to be called C major because it begins and ends on C. But if you think about it, and like I said earlier, in principle, we can move this to any key. Okay, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. For a brief minute, I want to talk about pentatonic scales. Now, so let's take a look. In fact, we've already seen pentatonic scales, believe it or not, because when we looked at the sharps and flats in the last video, we saw these 2 collections, either D flat, E flat, G flat, B flat, and A flat. The other one is the sharps, which is actually the same 5 black notes, right? C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, equal D flat, E flat, G flat, A flat, and B flat. So those 2, as we saw in the last video, are the same collections of 5 notes. And this is actually also what's going to be called a pentatonic scale. And that's why you'll hear people play all kinds of stuff on just the black notes of the piano because it actually makes a very nice scale, just the black notes. And these are called pentatonic because what does pentatonic mean? Well, read it closely, read it slowly out loud. Penta, okay, that's 5, right? And then tonic, well, that's just another word for tones. So we've got here 5 tones. 5 tones in the scale. Pentatonic scale is just a scale with 5 tones. Now, is that it though? Because you could have any 5 tones. You could have any random 5 tones. So what about these 5 tones is special? Well, once again, it has to do with the pattern of half steps and whole steps that's within them. So let's just take the one on the left. So between D flat and E flat, well, that's a whole step. We can see there's D in the middle, so that's a half steps. 2 half steps equal a whole step. So between D flat and E flat, that's a whole step. And then let's take a look between E flat and G flat. I've left it blank because if you count them up, we got 3 half steps there. It's too big. It's too big. It's not a half step. It's not a whole step because whole step's only 2 half steps. It's 3 half steps. Anyways, then we get to G flat and A flat. That's a whole step. Then A flat and B flat. That's a whole step. So what are we going to say there? Well, for now, because we haven't covered intervals in their entirety, let's call this just 3 half steps. Okay? So in the order of the pentatonic scale, we've got then whole step, 3 half steps, whole step, whole step. So again, whole, 3 half, whole. And then if we want to get to D flat again, because we start and end on D flat. Here we only have D flat, E flat, G flat, A flat, and B flat. But what if we wanted to get to D flat again? How far is that from B flat? B flat up to the next D flat is 3 half steps again. Right? So just the same distance as it was from E flat to G flat. Okay, so that is the essence of the pentatonic scale. Just like the major scale was whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now the pentatonic scale is going to be whole, then 3 halves, then whole, whole, then 3 halves, then whole, then 3 halves, then whole, whole, then 3 halves, etc. Okay, so we actually did see some pentatonic scales besides just the black notes also, because in the reading I provided you with this article by Lu-Ting and translated by Han Kuo Hang, and then it's called On Chinese Scales and National Modes. And the article was about how a lot of times, or people in the West, Europe and Americas and everything, tend to look down on Chinese classical music and say, oh, well, it's too simple. It's just based on these 5 tones. They haven't really reached our fully developed 7-tone scale of major, which is a really old-fashioned and I think kind of moronic belief, because nowadays we know, of course, that different scales are appropriate for different moods and can express different things. So why is it inherently that one would be more complex than another just because it has more notes? And another question for you, is complexity really the most important thing anyways? I mean, some of the most beautiful music I've ever heard is by far the simplest. So I think that is important to think about too, that it's not that complexity is some kind of wonderful thing here. I mean, music is very complex, but in other ways it's very simple. And I think there's many beautiful things that can happen there when you mix and match complexity and simplicity, explore different kinds of complexity. Yeah, you get that. And in this article, Lu-Ting is emphasizing the fact that Chinese music is actually very diverse and not just based on this 5-tone scale, although a lot of the music of the Han people from back in the day is. So, but his point in the article, which you should go look up, is their scales there's often added notes. There's other scales that aren't even based on the pentatonic scale at all. There's scales that resemble major and minor. There's scales that are completely different. So his point was, come on guys, it's much more complicated than that. This article is a little bit older, but I think provides some wonderful examples also of uses of modified pentatonic modes and of actual notated folk melodies, which is kind of cool. So anyways, the scale that we see in there is another pentatonic scale that's just not the black note pentatonic scale, but here it starts on C. And we can see here it just in our letters here, C, D, E, G, A. Let's take a look at some of these other ones and how they relate to each other. So in this case, we get this pattern between C and D, whole, whole, then 3 halves, then whole, then 3 halves. Okay, so that was actually the same, or very similar to the one we saw before. It would be the same to the one, for example, if we see on G flat. Okay, so then we have whole, whole, 3 halves, whole, 3 halves. Okay, so that was very similar to what we saw with all the black notes. And then look, there's different ways of rotating the scale, of moving it, of starting on different pitches, but keeping the same collection of notes. But first, let's compare these two to each other, major and then pentatonic, which now you can't see there, but I've written it is a subset. In other words, it's contained within the major scale, actually. This particular pentatonic scale is. So in this case, we're just leaving out the notes F and the notes B from the major scale, and we get the pentatonic scale. Because as we learned, the major scale is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And then in the pentatonic scale, we have whole, whole, three halves. Whole, three halves. I'll let you do that math, but, you know, they work. This is just a subset of the major. Let's look at those rotations that were in the article. So first, you've got that first one starting on C and going up to C, where we've got whole, whole, three halves, whole, three halves. Then the next one starting on D has a slightly different feeling. The next one starting on E. This is another one where it's like the same notes, but sort of a different mood. You see what I mean? Oops, sorry, whoops, wrong note. So this was the one starting on G, the fourth one down. Okay, and then this was the fifth one starting on A. So these could all be different scales. In this case, we are using the same notes and just starting on a different note, but using the same order of half steps and whole steps. So you can see that there, I hope, where all the whole steps line up, all the three halves line up, all the whole steps line up, all the three halves line up, all the whole steps there. So what you can see there is how, and it's the same notes that I've put in the columns. So you can see how this scale is just rotating around. It's not actually changing keys. It's not actually changing the notes. You can see how there's this option of rearranging the scale, where we take the same notes and we reorder them. Or there's the other option of changing the notes around in a scale, which I mentioned before. So going back to that, we had C major, and C major was this pattern of half steps and whole steps. Now you can imagine, just like in the last example, in the pentatonic example, we could keep this pattern where it is, the whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, and we could start and end on D. But just keeping those notes and just rotate this scale like we just saw. We could start and end on E. And they would give us slightly different feelings. We'd still be using only the white notes. And they wouldn't really sound like major anymore. Let me start on E. Okay, that's weird already, right? Just rotating the scale, going back to C major, same notes. Very different sound, very different sound. So that's kind of an interesting thing already with how we can rotate the notes around within the scale. But as I said, if we take this whole set of whole steps and half steps, and we want to start and end on a different note, like say G major, can we see what happens when we apply the pattern to a totally different note? Not just rotating the scale, not just keeping the same notes, but actually applying a half step and whole step pattern to a new key, getting G major as a scale. Let's see. So we know we're gonna have to start and end on G, right? If we want G major, because we just showed that if we, do any other notes, you're gonna get something different, like even C major notes, but starting and ending on E, sounds pretty weird. So if we want the G major scale, we're gonna need to start and end on G. So that's our first step. I usually will just put down G and G. Then we're going to need to fill in all the spaces between G and G. And we're going to fill it in with 7 separate notes until we get to G again, right? And that's going to be 1 for each letter name on the keyboard. So each letter name is going to get 1 note per scale when we have 7 note scales. So like in major and minor, there's going to be 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, etc. 1G, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E, 1F, 1G. Okay? Now, are we done? No, all we've done so far is taken the C major scale, just the white notes, and we've rotated it so it starts and ends on G. And it's going to sound like this. Remember, C major sounds like this. Now if we start and end on G. Wait. That's slightly different. Now, the difference isn't just that they're sounding on different pitch levels. The difference is between the top 2 notes. The difference is in scale degree 7 Okay, now we can start to recognize when we apply the half step and whole step pattern. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Whoa, check it out. Right there at the end, I've marked it in red because there's a problem. Right where we need a whole step is actually right now a half step between 6 and 7. And where we need a half step between 7 and 8 or 7 and 1, right now we have a whole step. So the half step is also wrong. So we need a whole and a half there, but they're flipped, they're reversed. So what are we going to do? Now think for a second. How can we adjust this? How can we make this whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half? Well, we're going to need to think back to the second video on pitch. We're going to need to use our sharps and flats to get to a new key. So G major is going to have a different collection of 7 notes than C major had, obviously, because when we were in C major, we just rotated the scale to G. It didn't work. Now we need a sharp. So let's take a look. If we add a sharp to scale degree 7, it raises it up and puts a half step next to scale degree 1. That's good because that's what we need as a half step between those last 2 notes. We need a half step between 7 and 1. Just like C major had between B and C, now we need to artificially make a half step between F sharp and G. Okay, and then that actually is nice because just adding a sharp like that solves both problems. It turns the half step into a whole step between 6 and 7, and it turns the whole step into a half step between 7 and 1. So it flips them around and fixes the problem. Now we have G major. We're good to go. G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. Now let's listen to it. Let's compare. Here's C major. Here's G major now. With F sharp. So hear how now F sharp and G get that same interaction that B and C had in the C scale. So again, it's about interactions, it's about relationships, it's about these intervals. Now, let's do one more example, and then we won't let the video go terribly long. Let's construct the F scale. So you guys might already have a feel for how to do this now. If I asked you to construct a major scale on any note, could you do it? Well, now you can, right? Because all you have to do is follow these steps. First, go from F to F, because those are going to be your scale degree 1 and scale degree 8 or scale degree 1. So we're going to need to draw out all the notes in between F and F, and then apply the whole steps and half steps. We know whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now, I'm going to say this a few more times just to drill it into your head. But yeah, now we can apply this pattern here and take a look. Does it fit? Just like we did with the last one. We notice that the pattern breaks down now in a different spot. So for G major, it broke down at the scale degree 7 area. Now here in F major, it's breaking down at the scale degree 4 area. And where we need whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, what we have right now is whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half. Okay, so something, again, is off and they're flipped. What we're going to need to do is lower scale degree 4, make scale degree 4 flat so it's close to scale degree 3, because between scale degree 1 and 2 there's a whole step, between 2 and 3 there's a whole step, between 3 and 4 we need a half step. Now B flat and A will get us that half step, and then B flat to C becomes a whole step. So once again, the flat there solves both problems for us, and we end up with an F major scale. Voila, with B flat. So the F major scale, F, G, A, B flat. Okay, actually I should have played F major without B flat before, because it's actually completely... So here's the C major scale. Now if I just rotate that, if I keep the same notes from the C major scale and start on F, you can hear that, right? You can hear that difference. But now when we're really wanting F major, we got to get those relationships to be the same. So we're going to end up with B flat. Okay, so F, G, A, B flat, instead of what was before, B natural. It sounds weird. Too many whole steps. Here we go with B flat. Whole, whole, half. Whole, 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 half. Okay, so if I ask you to write a scale starting on basically any note, Just apply that pattern of whole steps and half steps. The one stair in the scale per letter. Okay, so like I didn't make that into A sharp. I didn't go F, G, A sharp, C, D, E, F, because that would be skipping B and having two A's in there. So why didn't I make that A sharp? Well, because I want one note per letter name. So F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F. And that gives us that major scale. So that to finally review here, that pattern of half steps and whole steps is really what's crucial in making up a scale. Whether that's a chromatic scale, all half steps. Whether that's the whole tone scale, all whole steps. Whether that's the pentatonic scale, a whole step, then a couple half steps, and a whole step, couple half steps. And then the pentatonic we saw was actually just the major missing a few notes. So then the major scale, which had this pattern, whole, half, whole, half, will make any major scale every time. Next week, we'll learn about minor.